This is Jacqueline Luqman with the Real News Network. Much has been made about the pre-existing health conditions that are prevalent in Black and other marginalized communities of color that make us more susceptible to COVID-19, but not enough is discussed about a particular side effect to living in a society that has created the conditions that make this true and that makes contending with this new threat to us even more difficult. Here to talk with me about how trauma is affecting marginalized communities of color, especially during the coronavirus pandemic, is Dr. Altha J. Stewart. Dr. Stewart is the immediate past president of the American Psychiatric Association, the Senior Associate Dean for Community Health Engagement, Chief of Social Community Psychiatry, as well as the Director of the Center for Health and Justice-Involved Youth at the University of Tennessee Health Science Center in Memphis, Tennessee. Dr. Stewart, thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thank you for inviting me to be here and talk to you about these important issues today.
Dr. Stewart, the discussion around trauma experienced by people of African descent as a result of centuries of oppression in this country and abroad is not a new discussion. Certainly within our medical and academic and definitely our revolutionary circles, we've talked about things like post-traumatic slave disorder as a type of post-traumatic stress disorder and generational trauma for quite some time. But this discussion is being renewed and brought out into the mainstream, so to speak, especially as we face this new threat, the spread of COVID-19 and its disproportionate impact on historically marginalized communities of color. So why is this a discussion that we need to have and take very seriously, especially now?
Well, primarily, this is the discussion we need to have because we're now in the midst of the perfect storm. We knew forever that there were disparities in access to healthcare, disparities in life situations and how we live as a community. We knew these things were there and were a problem. We've talked about ways to eliminate or reduce disparities. We've taken small steps in trying to achieve that reduction or elimination. But what has happened now has brought to light in ways perhaps that we might not otherwise have seen it as clearly, that we must begin to work on these disparities because it is not just that we are more vulnerable because we have higher rates of those things that make us vulnerable. It's that we have the higher rates because of the way the society has dictated we will live and be served from healthcare and our economic and educational status and all those other indicators of health and well-being. If you live in a neighborhood where all of the houses are dilapidated, we know through our research, science-based research, that those are conditions that lead to depressed mood, anxiety, behavioral challenges that people seem to not have an answer or an explanation for. We describe children who respond to their environment as bad kids, as opposed to kids who've been exposed to trauma. So we know these things occur. We know why they occur. We've got enough scientific evidence to support trauma as a reality in the lives of people, brown and Black people, going way into the future. What we have not done enough of, and what we are not currently doing yet with respect to COVID-19, is look for how we make the solutions, how we resolve these things, what kinds of policies, what new kinds of practices, things as simple as everyone in the nation has heard the word sheltering in place, safer at home, whatever your jurisdiction calls it, you're supposed to stay in because you're safe. And if you're an essential worker, you're supposed to go out and work. But when you come home, you're supposed to take off your clothes, put them in a bag, launder them. Well, the example I have come to use of late when talking with policymakers is, if I live in a 3-room, not 3-bedroom, 3-room home or apartment, and there are 7 of us living in this home, and 4 people in this home are what we call vulnerable because of health status or because of other things, and I'm the essential worker who goes out every day and risks bringing back and exposing them. And in the nighttime, I sleep with my grandmother and my child sleeps between us. The other people sleep, we have the only bed. The other people sleep on a mattress on the floor and everybody else is scattered wherever they can find space. How do I protect them? When I'm the person who makes the money, comes in, buys the food, pays the rent so that we have a roof over our head, how do we translate good public health policy and practice into a language that is consistent with the lifestyle that many people are forced to lead? And they're not doing this because they choose to live in this environment. This is the best they can do with what they have. When our policymakers and educators and healthcare providers and other folks begin to understand this is not just a sad state of affairs and tisk, shouldn't we do something about it? This is the rallying cry that should bring everyone in the nation to understand every time we fail to act on making sure everyone is healthy, we run the risk of making everybody unhealthy. And as long as Black and brown people don't have access to good health care, don't have a standard of living that allows them to be accountable for making good life choices, as long as we don't educate people in a way that they can understand and adhere to. If you open a golf course today, but you don't open the city park today, I've got people who see just another example of getting the short end of the stick. Now, the public health rationale for opening the golf course is there are fewer people who are going to use it. We can better manage social distancing, and we get to try out, is it safe for people to be out and together? What is seen, however, is I got 7 kids in here that are driving me crazy. I need them to go outside and play or do something. They live together, so they ought to be able to play together, but I'm told I shouldn't let them out into the park because the park is closed and nobody's allowed in. That the perception, the optic, however you want to describe it, that just doesn't play well in the Black and brown community, because historical lessons tell us this is what we should come to expect from a society that does not value us, that does not care about our needs, that does not treat us with respect and dignity. So why should we expect anything else? And oh, by the way, why should we play by their rules? First thing we heard was, if you hadn't traveled overseas, you couldn't get it. The next thing we heard was, we have immunity to that. We didn't know what immunity was, but it didn't get us. The third thing we heard was, even if you get it, there's nothing you can do. So, that's your fate. And I'm going to die before 21 anyway, because I'm going to get shot or something's going to happen. So we have to make the message more consistent with the people that need to hear it. That's the first thing.
So, Dr. Stewart, there was a lot in what you just said. And I want to ask you about the trauma that we live under, that we endure from living in conditions like that anyway. So, we've got a 40% poverty rate among Black people. It's higher in Native communities, a little bit less in Latino communities. But, so PTSD in Black people is dismissed as something that's not real. But that's an extremely stressful situation to live in. And it is linked to history that we have lived through, the history of oppression. Now, although many people recognize PTSD as perfectly logical when they're talking about Holocaust survivors and their children, so there's that contradiction. So they understand that it's a real thing for other people, but not for us. But it's also very real because, as you noted, we still live it. It's not just history we're talking about, but we're talking about the persistent conditions we live in that came from that history, right? And this is why, not our behavior, but the conditions we continue to live in, that we're forced to live in, that you said, that make us more vulnerable to the ravages of COVID-19, right? So what are some of those conditions, if you can expound a little more on that?
Well, we start at the top of the pyramid with what we call structural racism. When the infrastructure of a society is designed, intentionally designed, and continued and maintained over a period of time to assure that there is a subordinate group that is convinced that that is where they must be and can never move away from, and a superior group that says, we are here and you can never reach here. it becomes really difficult to break that mindset after generations of incorporating that into the very DNA sometimes of the people who are living those kinds of situations. Many people who live in conditions of poverty don't see a way out, don't understand how one can overcome that, don't see a path to different or better or anything. They don't see it for themselves. They don't see it for their children. They didn't see it, and their parents didn't see it for them. And it goes back many, many generations, as you noted. The issue around how you begin to address the trauma related to that generational traumatic experience that has become a part of the fabric of the individual. We have studies that suggest even if I didn't experience a certain kind of trauma, if my grandmother experienced it, somehow I am impacted by that. And when pressed in my current life, I am aware that that is what is going on. That kind of trauma transmission actually happens, that grandma could have an experience of an assault or abuse or something, and we are primed and hyper vigilant about that same experience, even though we've never had it. There is a mechanism in the body, and the body is just a machine. It's a nice, well-oiled machine that does biologically all the things we need in terms of survival, but it is in fact just a machine. And what you put into the body is what you can expect to get out of the body. It's like the computer, garbage in, garbage out. And I don't say that in a malicious or pejorative way, but to explain to people that if we have these lived experiences that we are either not talking about, not dealing with, not addressing how they came to be and what we need to do to help ourselves get out of them. When we have those experiences, we imprint that experience onto us and we pass it on to the next generation. Children who are exposed to trauma grow up, this is all science. I wish I could say this is just Dr. Stewart's rants and raves, but this is all science. Children who are exposed to trauma in the early stages of their development develop serious medical problems. So let's say I'm a child born into a family where we live in poverty, where our impoverished condition means we only have certain things that we can rely on, maybe running water, maybe access to some mechanism to buy food, to keep a roof over our head, maybe even a way to get transportation to essential places. But let's say that that's my life. And for the first 5 to 7 years of my life, that's all I know. I watch the people around me be depressed and perhaps fall to the ravages of drug abuse, or they smoke or they drink. And that's my life. And then I go to school and I'm told in school that I'll never amount to anything. I'll never learn. I'm stupid. I'm dumb. And I'm bad. And then I begin to believe that stuff. And so I become, quote, bad. And then, now that I'm impoverished, under-resourced in so many ways, don't have the ideal family life, and am struck by the fact that even the external world outside of my house says these things about me, I'm going to start believing that now. And if I'm a young Black man and I'm now 13, 14, 15, the street offers me something that I can't get anywhere else sometimes. And so I begin to get on this other path, which may in fact lead me down another road, which may in fact contribute to my getting onto the school to prison pipeline, which then of course sets the course for the rest of my life. We all know the studies that say, if you can't read by the 3rd grade, they're building a prison cell for you. These are the kinds of things that early trauma sets in motion, things that are preventable. It does not, people don't have to live in poverty if as a society we decide that's not acceptable. People have to not have food or live in food deserts or be reliant on a public transportation system that does not meet their needs, or have to live and work in low wage, minimum wage jobs that can barely keep them sustained unless that's what society intends to happen.
And then we are living in a society where more and more of us are coming to realize that this is exactly the situation society wants us to be in as we learn our history, because information is more widely accessible now. So now even at earlier ages, we understand that this is what society intends for us, because this is where they intentionally put us, and they make the roadblocks to overcome these things almost insurmountable. So, Dr. Stewart, as the media and representatives of the current administration act like they're focusing on the disproportionate effect of the virus and what it's having on our communities of color, Black, Latino, Native American, they get part of the narrative right. They talk about these health issues, but they avoid discussing the whys that you just point out, the why these issues are this way. And they immediately go into talking about those lifestyle issues, like what and how much we eat. And they do what the Surgeon General did and talk about how Black, Latino, and Native people in particular need to abstain from smoking, drinking, and drugs. Now, does this help protect vulnerable people the way that conversation is framed, or does this stereotype marginalize people of color even more by focusing on and assigning amoral behavior specifically to just us?
You know, that's an excellent question, because it's in the lane of blame the victim. If you suffer from PTSD, one of the treatments is to find things that calm you down, that take you away from that hyper vigilant, hyper anxious place, and that provide you with some solace and comfort so that you can begin to reduce the level of stress and the impact of the trauma. And we know from studying all populations that things like eating and the types of food that you eat, we call them actually comfort foods, I believe, in some communities, and that people drink and smoke as a means of self-medication and anti-stress practices. And so blaming the victim for a condition that was imposed upon them by the very people who are now blaming them for having the condition is a bit like the pot calling the kettle black in the vernacular. So from my standpoint, the way we get past that is that we help people understand that while there is some measure of personal responsibility to how we get out of it, there is no question about how we got into it. And that if we can remain focused on, we are going to be the problem solvers and not the explainers or the excuse makers or anything else. We don't have to defend ourselves. We have to help ourselves. It is the reliance on the system to fix it that helps us stay grounded in the problem. And once we can begin to learn and incorporate things like churches, if you eat a meal at church that is not nutritionally healthy based on your current health status, someone has to say, Pastor, I think we need to start cooking the greens with turkey instead of fatback.
Mm-hmm.
Someone needs to say the kinds of things that will help us are fresh fruits and salads. And while I love black-eyed peas and I love macaroni and cheese and I love all of those wonderful foods, as part of our overall health and well-being, we have a role to play in changing lifestyles. It won't get me out of poverty. It won't keep me from being in a certain kind of job, perhaps, but it will put me on the path to being healthier. And as I am healthier, I am more able to participate in the change, in the policy change, in the funding change, in the allocation of resources change, in the electoral process that gets people into office who don't care about making change. There are all kinds of benefits, I think, when people assume the responsibility that is theirs instead of absorbing the responsibility that is not.
And this is really an important nuance in this conversation about personal responsibility, which is always something that the media, people in the media, and certainly people on the more conservative leaning part of the political spectrum will always bring up, but they never tie that to how we can or how we need to use that as a kind of strength in order to participate in the structural change, pushing for the legislative and the political change that created the situation that put us in that position in the first place. So I really appreciate the way you explain that, because like you, Dr. Stewart, I love some good old down home soul food, but I have absolutely learned to cook my greens with smoked turkey necks instead of fat back, and cut back on the fried foods and eat a lot more fresh vegetables. But that also comes in conjunction with understanding that many of our communities don't have access to the kinds of fresh foods and healthier choices that people want to make. And how do we get people to advocate for those things once they become aware of them? So that is an important nuance that is left out of this discussion that I thank you very much for making. So now I want to ask you, Dr. Stewart, how in the world do we endure, not just endure, that's not the right word, how do we survive and even overcome this new crisis of COVID-19 with our emotional and mental health intact? And I am asking you this not just as a journalist. I'm asking you because I'm wondering myself. I'm not asking just for our viewers, because I don't want our viewers to feel like they're alone in this anxiety and stress that I know they feel. So I'm just going to be honest, Dr. Stewart, I'm asking for myself because I'm wondering how I'm going to get through this emotionally and with my own what emotional and mental well-being intact as I worry about family and friends, and how do we confront the system that has created this situation? How do we confront a media that blames us and a society that piles on with that blame? How do we deal with the weight of that trauma and take care of ourselves and protect ourselves and our family members and loved ones through all of this? How do we do it?
Well, that's another excellent question that I'm so happy you asked. I get asked that question 2-3 times a day now, by people who ask both for themselves and for others. And I think there are a few things that I say in answer to that. First is having the courage to ask the question indicates that you're aware that this is wearing on you and that you want to know how to deal with it. The awareness and acceptance of the fact that it has to be dealt with is the first thing. That brings you to the understanding of the education about what to do about it. That takes us to the importance of doing whatever that is on a consistent basis, building into your daily schedule. I will have this positive attitude. I said to a group a few days ago when someone asked me that question similarly, and I said, you know, I've made it my business during this particular crisis that I'm going to start the day happy. And if I don't feel it when I wake up, I turn on Pharrell and I sing along with Happy. I'm so happy. That allows me to consciously, intentionally, and deliberately focus on, I need to have a positive attitude to get through this. The other thing that I am encouraging everyone that is in the sound of my voice to do is stop looking at the news 24/7. Every breaking news story will still be breaking tomorrow. And half of the stuff that we look at and hear on the news only serves to aggravate us more and make us more anxious and angry. We can do without that extra fuel. We don't need that trigger to light our fire. There's enough in our very real world to know we got problems now. We're going to have more problems in the future. And if we burn out now, we won't be able to deal with what's on the other side of this crisis. The final thing is be understanding, offer yourself and others some grace. You know, everything is not frenetic and frantic and demanding and now. This is a time of great stress and crisis. You don't get through those things by adding more stress and crisis. You get through those things by stopping, being quiet, thinking about what can I control today? What can I manage to be in control of today? If I can get through today, controlling what I know I can do, I can rest tonight and get up tomorrow and start all over again. This is the one day at a time that many people have come to live with, that many of us are being forced to accept. All of us type A personalities like to do, get, done. Now is not that time. Now we cannot do it because every day brings another challenge. The example I gave earlier about the family and how do you explain to a family that's barely making it that unless they socially isolate and stay at home and socially distance themselves, stay at home and stay isolated if they're positive, how do you explain to them how to do that when they don't have the resources, the space, the understanding? We are trying to implement a public health strategy without educating the public. It doesn't work. It won't work. We have to do it differently. And especially when it comes to Black and brown people who have a general mistrust of medicine, science, and the people who are dictating what will and will not happen. This is not going to work unless some people like us begin to translate that message into things that are believable and credible and make sense in the context of what it's like to be Black in America.
That is really that I'm sorry, that's just a salve for my soul right now. I'm just going to say it. Thank you so much. I needed to hear that. Now, I want to end this discussion by telling our viewers that you will be featured on a special segment of the Oprah Winfrey Network's show, Black Women Own the Conversation, on this very topic of how COVID-19 is affecting Black people. Now, aside from obviously washing your hands as much as you can or using hand sanitizer if you have that available, being careful to stay physically 6 feet away from other people if that is possible, to limit your exposure to large groups of people, to be very careful with what you touch, to wipe down surfaces where you can to disinfect them. The other thing that is important in how we are going to not just survive, but overcome and thrive on the other side of this is information. So the episode of this show on the Oprah Winfrey Network that Dr. Stewart will be featured on to expound upon this conversation can be found on the OWN website. This is important. You know, we wouldn't do this otherwise here on The Real News if it were not. But you can find these episodes at www.oprah.com/app/Black Women Own the Conversation.html. I strongly encourage you all to watch it and to share it, as well as sharing this segment with your friends and family far and wide. Dr. Stewart, I wish we had more time to talk about all of the myriad implications that go into this issue and that need to come out of it. But what you have given us today, I really hope will give those who watch it the encouragement to keep pressing on, as it has given me, and some tips on how to take care of ourselves in this really, really difficult time. So I absolutely appreciate and thank you so much for your work, your expertise, and your wisdom today. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me. And I'm so glad I was able to join and share this information. Thank you.
And I thank you for watching, friends. This is Jacqueline Luqman with the Real News Network. Do not let them sacrifice you to their god of capitalism and capital and greed. Do not go lightly without a fight. Stay encouraged, stay safe, and stay informed.
Thanks a lot for watching. Appreciate it. But do us one more solemn favor. Hit the subscribe button below. You know you want to. Stay up on the videos.